Hey guys, it's Danny again with Partner Engineering. Welcome back to this series, the Cloud Migration Journey, where we are covering the three-phased migration approach, crawl, walk, run, to migrate our applications to the cloud. So if you've been following along, the first two videos were about crawl and the walk phase. This third video, we're going to be covering the last step in the three-phase migration approach, run. But before we get to it, let's go ahead and recap what we've done so far. So in the crawl phase, we just introduced Konnect to our simulated on-premise environment, and it's close to where a monolith application is running. Once that gateway was deployed, we then went into Konnect and configured it to expose that monolith application. The walk phase is when we introduced Kong Mesh, and we took advantage of the fact that Kong Mesh is a universal deployment strategy. So the steps that we took here is we deployed the Kong Mesh global control plane running in an EC2 instance, and then in our on-premise environment, we also deployed the universal zone services to host an on-premise Kong Mesh zone. Once that zone was ready to go, for all of the services we deployed, we wanted supported on the mesh. That's our gateway and our monolith. Each of those services was provisioned an envoy sidecar. Once that was in place, we then went back into Konnect and wrote a new gateway service and route so that we could have the traffic flow over the mesh network. Now run. What are we going to be doing in this stage? In this last tutorial, we're actually going to be spinning up our cloud zone. That's going to be an Amazon EKS cluster. We're going to have our new microservice disputes running in a namespace on the EKS cluster. We're going to leverage not Konnect, but we're going to leverage Kong Mesh traffic policies to reroute the disputes API traffic from the monolith to this new microservice running in the cloud. Okay, so we're gonna move over to the Git repository. And if you're following along, we're on step 7. So go ahead and copy this phase out, or copy this command out. Still logged into a VM. So from the parent directory of the project, go ahead and execute that phase. While this phase is executing, it's going to take a few minutes because we're deploying the Helm charts onto Mesh. So let's go ahead and into the Explore document and talk about what's going on. So what we're doing in this phase is twofold. We already have the EKS cluster spun up, but what we're doing is we're using the Kubernetes mode deployment strategy of Kong Mesh to go ahead and create that cloud zone. Once that's in place, the second thing that we're doing is that we're deploying the disputes microservice over to the cluster and then making sure that that namespace is annotated or labeled in such a way that any pods spun up in that namespace are automatically provisioned that sidecar and synced with Kong Mesh. So all of that manifest work that we had to do for universal mode, given that we're in Kubernetes, that's going to be handled for us. And so just like we saw a minute ago, the infrastructure that we're going to have is we've got our global CP running in an EC2 instance. In our on-premise zone, we've got our universal zone services still running in the VM. And then for our Kubernetes cluster, for this cloud zone, we'll have a namespace that's going to host our Kubernetes zone services. We'll navigate in there and take a look at it really briefly, just so that we can validate that we see all of the same services that we have deployed for universal mode. And then we'll take a look at the disputes microservice. So let's go ahead and take a look now that the install is done. For Playbook 3, let's go ahead and take a look at the infrastructure in EKS. So from the command line, I want you to go ahead, we're going to export the kube config. Go ahead and write the command so that we can see everything that's going on in the Kong Mesh system namespace. Okay, so what do we have here? We've got this zone control plane. We've got 2 egress pods and 2 ingress pods. The services to reach all of those. So mesh gets a service, there's zone, mesh gets a service, egress, and ingress get a service. Okay, so basically, just point in case that all of the same services we deployed in universal mode in the VM, we do still have deployed in Kubernetes. And then let's go ahead and check on the microservice that we've got running as well. It's a namespace microservice, so go ahead and type out this command. And what we've got, you can see we've got 2 for 2 because it was automatically provisioned the sidecar because it just labeled the namespace so that any pod deployed in the namespace would be synced into the mesh. And then it's got all of the typical manifests that we expect for Kubernetes. Just to make sure we're not crazy, let's go ahead and describe the namespace microservice. And you can see right here, it's got the label Kuma sidecar injected enabled, because we can also disable it as well. Okay, so that's just a proof of concept that not much has changed, or that the Kubernetes deployment strategy and the universal deployment strategy, while we're not relying on Kubernetes to deploy our processes for us, it's still the same, fundamentally. Now let's go ahead and move on to the tutorial where we're actually going to start to redirect disputes traffic. So what we need to do is, just like we did before, we need to log into the Cog Mesh global control plane. Let's go ahead and SSH in. I'm grabbing my SSH global CP command from my demo facts, just in case we've forgotten. SSH'd in. And we're going to run this first policy right here. Phase 3, 1 Kong reroute. Let's go ahead and execute that. There was no error in the output, so it succeeded. Let's go up to the mesh GUI and let's go ahead and validate what's going on. First thing on the left-hand side from the zones, we can see we've got 2 zones now, cloud and on-premise. That lines up. We've got 3 ingresses and 3 egresses. 2 for cloud, 1 for on-premise. Same thing for the egress, 2 for cloud, 1 for on-premise. Let's check out our services. Before we just had Kong and the monolith. Now we've got a new service called microservice, also of type internal. So that lines up. Let's go ahead and take a look at our policies for the first time. So in the left-hand side, select policies. I want you to go to this drop-down panel in the center where it says circuit breaker, expand, and move down to where it says traffic route. And now we can see that we have 2 routes. We have Kong reroute and we have route all default. The Kong reroute is more specific than the route all default, so the Kong reroute will take effect for us. Let's read what the policy says. So the policy says it's of type traffic route. This is working in the mesh default. The name of it's Kong reroute. When you have a incoming request that matches to the service Kong, that is our gateway, and it's intended for the monolith service, we're going to go ahead and rewrite that. If there's a prefix match for monolith resources card disputes, direct that traffic to the microservice. Everything else will be directed to the monolith. So essentially, visually what this traffic route is doing is the following. The API client will hit the gateway, incoming request to the gateway. Everything that is not monolith resources card dispute, so the dispute endpoints exposed by the monolith, everything will be directed to the monolith, but the disputes API traffic. That disputes API traffic will be directed to the microservice running in the cloud zone. Now that we've applied the policy, we can test this from Insomnia. So we're just going to, in the phase 2, phase 3 subfolder in Insomnia, I want you to go ahead and execute the requests top down. This card is still working. Payments, still working. Balances is working. Charge is working. Oh, but disputes is actually not working. Okay, so this was an intended failure. This was a planned failure because we just wrote a new microservice. It's got a 404. This was not found. Monolith resources card dispute, which is true, right? When we write a new microservice, it's not going to have the same characteristics or the same endpoints as our original monolithic application. It's going to have new endpoints. So how are we going to fix that? So let's go back up to our Git repository. Let's go check out the next step. So now I want you to copy this command that's phase 3 to Kong reroute. Go ahead and copy this over. And then from the terminal in the global mesh, if you're still logged into the global mesh control plane, I want you to go ahead and execute that command. And we're just going to go back to the Kong mesh GUI and go check out what this policy says. This updated policy states the following. When you have an incoming request targeted for Kong, the gateway, and it's intended for the monolith, if there's a match for monolith resource card dispute, first modify that URL to /disputes and then direct it to the microservice. All other traffic by default will go to the monolith. Okay, so what we're attempting to do here is to correct the URL so that it matches the microservice before directing the traffic over. So now when we go back to Insomnia and we execute the request again, we should not get A 404. Yes, we got a 200 status, and you can see that the response has changed. We're now actually getting a valid JSON response from that new microservice. Meanwhile, keep in mind that all of these other monolithic services are still functioning, so the proof is in the pudding, just in case. Balance is there, payments is there, and card is there. And we didn't deploy these microservices in Kubernetes, so it really is honestly pointing at the monolith. So visually, again, let's just revisit about what we just did. To do the traffic rerouting, we actually didn't use the gateway to do it. We actually just wrote one policy to focus on pointing all traffic to the monolith, and then we relied on the mesh to go ahead and reroute and deprecate each service from the monolith as we needed. So that is your flywheel. That is the run. Your network infrastructure is in place, so now you can, first we deprecated disputes. Now you can imagine going back in and deprecating payments, and then going in and deprecating charges, one at a time and incrementally, just as you need. What else is the beauty of this strategy is the rollback. We've centralized traffic management to 2 locations across our entire hybrid cloud infrastructure, Konnect and the mesh. So a rollback strategy is much easier to plan, right? Disputes doesn't go as expected, that's okay. Just go back into Cogmesh, roll back that policy, and the traffic will be redirected to the monolith. So I hope you guys enjoyed this tutorial on the cloud migration strategy, crawl, walk, run. The tutorial we stated before, but we'll repeat again. It's totally free. It's publicly available in GitHub, so go ahead and pull it down and get started. If there's any questions at all, please feel free to open up an issue on the repository and let us know if there's any questions at all.